pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If you've tuned in, this is one of our regular meetings. We called a special meeting to discuss some budget issues. Before we begin, are there any comments and statements? Go ahead, Mr. Vieira. You can walk right up to the mic. That way we can hear you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you recognizing me and Dr. Colley and the members of the school committee. Monday night at the Board of Selectmen's meeting, I made the recommendation that we go to the ballot, that we separate the bond issue for highway and schools, and I wanted to let you know that personally. It hasn't passed yet. We'll be discussing it on the 27th, so you have an opportunity to weigh in on that, and I'm here today to discuss that with you if you're interested, but just very briefly, the reason I did that, I will support the schools as well as the highway department, so I'm not doing that because I want to divide and conquer in some way. But I do think it's important that the taxpayers have an opportunity to be heard on both issues, and I really feel very strongly that that's the most appropriate way to do that. I also respect the school committee and what you're trying to do, and wanted to be up front and talk about that, and I want you to hear that second or third hand in terms of where we were coming with that. My intention on the 27th is to try to get that. We need a 4-to-1 vote to do that. We had a 3-to-2 vote at this last meeting. So one way or the other, we need to decide at the Board of Selectmen 4-to-1 to go one way or the other with this, either combining the two for one vote or separating them. And I just feel in talking to folks in town and being a member of this community for many years that when you go to the polls, you'd like an opportunity to make that decision for that vote. And when you combine any issue, you don't do that. I understand there's some rationale for that at town meeting because it's a smaller participation of the population. But at the polls, hopefully, people can have that distinction if they decide they want to do that. I feel very confident that you know, each individual one will pass or fail based on the involvement that we have in whether it be the schools or highway or groups in town that feel passionately about this issue. We need to get the vote out to do that. So I don't think that having them together solves that purpose necessarily, unless one side or the other feels the only way it could pass is to get the vote out that way. But having said that, I'll be available for questions or give you the opportunity for comments on that if you would like. But that was the rationale behind it. It certainly wasn't anti-school in the process, although I think some people have perceived it that way, and I wanted to clarify that.
I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm sure the rest of the board does as well, coming tonight and explaining your logistics and your logic behind it. I think, do you want to go into this now since it's on the agenda for tonight, or do you want to wait till the end?
It's up to you. We can, it's, you know, looking at the monies we have for this year and next year, the whole is going to tie together, so.
Okay. Are there any other comments or statements from anybody here?
Yes.
From the public, I'm sorry. Would you like to comment on Mr. Vieira's statement?
Whenever you think the time's appropriate.
What I'd like to do is go to the review of the budget, and we'll discuss it at that point as well.
I was at the Board of Selectmen meeting. As a member of the public, I'm not the school committee liaison to the board. So I did hear the presentation, and it certainly made sense from both views regarding the ballot question. The only reason I asked to speak now is a question that I came up with myself, was wondering if the moderator has any input on the way the questions were worded. That is the Board of Selectmen to take that warrant article and make a question. Okay, so I personally, my sense is it's getting the attention of the Board of Selectmen, and I think that as they balance the appropriate way to go forward with it, I think it's in good hands.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? No? You went like this and no?
Well, we got an email. I just told the person, we all received an email, I would guess, because I think it said SC on it, from Mr. Hartnett. we're going to be getting into the budget. I don't know if Dr. Colley CC'd on that or not, on where we're going to be spending some monies. And his notion was some of the monies that we have is to buy the mats for the high school and also for the middle school. On the back walls, for the walls. That was his hope. That would also be my hope if we can get that into discussion tonight, because it is a safety issue. I'm at most of the basketball games and kids go flying into those walls. So on a safety point of view, until something happens, and I don't want to be reactive, I'd rather be proactive. And if we can put it into the budget of getting some mats, I'd love to be able to do that. And speaking for Mr. Hartnett in his email, I just wanted to put that out.
As the public, okay. All right, let's go right into the informational agenda. Item A, since we're already getting into the budget discussion, review of education budget for 2011. This is sort of evolved from our meeting on Wednesday to get a little bit more in depth about some of the monies that we have been able to scrimp and save over the year. And now we have to figure out what to do with it. So, Dr. Colley?
At the last school committee meeting, this is more or less what you would have gotten, but I figured you wanted it in more detail, so I added some detail to it. Just about every year, we end up with anywhere between 150 to 250,000 towards the month of June, looking into July. And it's one of those things that we budget for the worst case scenario all year, simply because you never know what's going to happen in any one given year. So if worst case scenario doesn't happen, you have monies available that you can use in a different way. I'll give you an example of, if one of the boilers were to basically die, we would need enough money built into the budget to turn around and go ahead and replace that boiler. In the food service program, for example, we have about $100,000 in reserve in the revolving account, again, because we have equipment in the cafeterias that are 50 years old, that when one of those pieces die, each one's about $50,000. So again, those are things that if they happen on any one given day, in order to turn around in a quick way to open back up, we would need a substantial amount of money. So we've been able to do that year after year. When those emergencies don't happen, then we turn to the end of the year and we look at things that we have never been able to budget. Now, one good example is textbooks. This year I could track some savings already through the end of April and into May, and that's why I came back and said to the school committee before we even went into town meeting that we could take care of the $72,000 worth of textbooks that we had been talking about to put into next year's budget. And I was feeling fairly comfortable that some of our savings were not going to be needed, in particularly around the area of the salaries and the savings from the salaries. Because you have some things like the guidance at the middle school. Once we hired in this spring, when we finally went around and hired again a new school adjustment counselor, it's not really guidance, I kind of knew we'd have some kind of a savings, but unless I could track it down to how much money that would be. The same thing in Spanish, science, all the maternity leaves we had this year. That number is unusual, by the way. It almost never happens that high. And we've had a couple of positions that I knew were still open that we didn't fill in. Like we kept trying to look to see if we could fill in the .2 sped at the middle school. That one was one that, I'm still looking. I still say the middle school needs some assistance in that area. We'll look to see what happens when we hire for a new assistant principal to see if we can pick up that .2. But anyway, as we were going through that, we then take a look and say, hey, if we have these savings, what are the things that we've been talking about over the last few years that we should get? And I realized that the mats may be one of those things we've talked about, and I'll explain why I didn't get into my list. But we know the textbooks. We have gone to the Capital Committee and to the FinCom to talk about technology. We were basically told that technology is such short term that it turns around. I mean, we use it for 10, 12 years. even though supposedly the lifespan of those things is 5 years or so. So nobody's ever wanted to put technology in a capital improvement plan or in a kind of a bond. So every year, I'll give you an example. Last year, we purchased some technology for both the high school and for the middle school. We purchased some laptops. And again, it wasn't that we didn't have the money, it's that we held the money till the end of the year and then released it because we figured we're not going to hit an emergency, hopefully, in a few weeks left of school. So we always have these things in the back of our heads. What are we going to go ahead and purchase if we have money left at the end of the year? This year was unusual. We had at least more money than I expected in the salary savings, mostly from the maternities and some of the changes that we had in staff over the middle of the year, which usually doesn't happen. Usually you get them at the beginning of the year and then you can move the money around. In terms of sped savings, if you look in there, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cases that generated quite a bit of money. And this is even beyond having prepaid some of the tuition, although that's limited for next year. And then as we went through this spring, looking at how much money was left in everybody's budget, we started saying, hey, are you going to need those open POs for this, that, and the other thing? In particularly the utilities, the maintenance, those parts, we do that on a regular basis because in maintenance, when something big dies, you're going to pay a pretty penny. Last year we did some maintenance improvements around this time of the year as well. So when we get to the beginning of June, as I did last year, come back to the school committee and say, hey, here's how much money we think we're going to have at the end of the year. Here's the things we would like to put together. Last year we sent $60,000 back to the town, but that's because we had gone in and asked for additional funding for SPED. So when that need in SPED did not come, we gave it back to the town. This is not necessarily something that we had planned on. None of these things. In terms of the maintenance, there are some things that have been in the list of things to do. So that's why I have come with some ideas of what we could use money for. One of the ones that Mike reminded me of is we're down at least one vehicle. In your packet, I gave a list of, all our vehicles, which are probably as old as the ones the town's trying to replace for the highway department. So one of the suggestions would be to go through the state bid list and see if we can pick up a pickup truck with a plow on it, because those are the ones that tend to get beat up the most. We end up replacing engines, transmissions, transfer cases, the whole 9 yards. So in looking at that, I gave you some ideas already earlier in the year, a month or so ago for the books. Like I said, we're talking about some of the maintenance things that we should take care of. And then we talked about projectors versus TVs. We want to see if we can move towards having more of the smart board approach, even though we're looking at a different company, but does the same thing as long as you have a whiteboard. And then I added some additional things that we could use money for, including some of the software services and other types of technology that we're looking to get. For example, this year here at the high school, one of the photocopiers died for about a month. Some people said, well, fine, then we send all this, all this, instead of photocopying, they were printing it. So our printers were basically running through ink like it was water. Again, we're getting caught with old equipment that when it dies, all of a sudden you're talking a big chunk of money to replace, and we've never been able to build it into the budget.